February 13th, 1945, 9:51 p.m. Oberst Hans Rumpf, chief of Leipzig's fire protection police, stood on the Rathaus Tower watching something that shouldn't exist. The city of Dresden, 75 miles to the southeast, was burning with such intensity that he could read a newspaper by the light. Not firelight reflected off clouds, direct illumination from a fire so massive it created its own weather system, visible across the curvature of the earth. In Dresden itself, 22-year-old Margaret Fryer was experiencing hell made real. The air itself was on fire, not figuratively. The superheated atmosphere had reached ignition temperature. People weren't burning from flames touching them. They were combusting spontaneously from radiant heat alone. She watched a woman carrying a baby burst into flames without any fire touching her. The infant, somehow protected by its mother's body, continued crying in the arms of a burning corpse for 3 seconds before it too ignited. What Rumpf was witnessing from Leipzig, what Fryer was dying in, was the culmination of a bombing strategy so controversial that its architect would be denied honours by the same government that ordered him to execute it. The firebombing of Dresden killed more people in 14 hours than the atomic bomb would kill at Hiroshima. It created temperatures exceeding those at the surface of the sun. It generated winds of hurricane force that sucked victims into the flames from hundreds of yards away. The attack transformed a city of 630,000 into an ash field, covering 6 square miles. Yet Dresden was neither the first nor the most deadly firebombing of World War II. It was simply the most visible, the one that would haunt the Allied conscience for generations. The story of how strategic bombing evolved from a theoretical concept to a weapon of apocalyptic destruction begins not in 1945 but in the trenches of World War I, where a young officer named Arthur Harris watched an empire exhaust itself trying to advance a few yards of mud. Harris, serving in France, witnessed firsthand the futility of ground warfare. Millions of men, years of combat, unimaginable casualties, all to shift lines on a map by miles. The experience convinced him that future wars couldn't be won by bleeding armies against fortifications. There had to be another way. The other way appeared in the skies above London on May 31st, 1915. German Zeppelin L-10, commanded by Hauptmann Erich Linartz, dropped incendiary bombs on the British capital. The raid killed 28 people and caused £60,000 of damage. More significantly, it caused mass panic. Thousands fled the city. Factory production dropped. The psychological impact exceeded the physical destruction by orders of magnitude. Harris, learning of the raid, saw the future of warfare. The bomber, he concluded, would always get through. No defence could stop determined aerial attack. The side that could deliver the most destruction from the air would win future wars not by destroying armies but by breaking the enemy's will to fight. Between the wars, Harris's theories found support in unexpected places. Italian General Giulio Douhet published The Command of the Air in 1921, arguing that strategic bombing could win wars independently of ground forces. American General Billy Mitchell demonstrated the principle by sinking captured German battleships from the air, proving that even the mightiest weapons of the previous era were obsolete. The British Air Ministry, desperate to maintain the Royal Air Force as an independent service, embraced strategic bombing as its core mission. But theory had to confront reality. The bombers of the 1920s and 1930s couldn't reliably hit specific targets. Navigation was primitive. Bomb sites were rudimentary. Even in perfect conditions, accuracy was measured in miles, not feet. The solution the RAF developed was area bombing. If you couldn't reliably hit a factory, you could reliably hit the city containing the factory. Destroy the city, you destroy the factory. Destroy enough cities, you destroy the enemy's capacity to make war. The morality of deliberately targeting civilians was hotly debated. International law, specifically the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, prohibited bombardment of undefended cities. The 1922 Hague Rules of Air Warfare, though never ratified, explicitly banned aerial bombardment of civilians. Britain's own Air Ministry initially maintained that civilian bombing was both illegal and immoral. Then Germany invaded Poland. On September 1, 1939, the Luftwaffe demonstrated what modern aerial warfare meant. Warsaw was systematically destroyed. 25,000 civilians died in the first month. The Wehrmacht called it terror bombing, psychological warfare to force surrender. It worked. Poland fell in 35 days. When Germany turned west in 1940, the pattern repeated. Rotterdam, declared an open city, was bombed anyway on May 14, 1940. 900 civilians died in minutes. The Dutch surrendered that same day. The message was clear. The Germans had abandoned any pretense of limiting warfare to military targets. Britain, fighting for survival, concluded that matching German methods was not just justified, but necessary. On February 14, 1942, the Air Ministry issued Directive No. 22 to RAF Bomber Command. The directive marked the end of precision bombing attempts and the beginning of deliberate area bombing. The wording was carefully crafted to maintain plausible deniability. It stated that operations should focus on the morale of the enemy civil population, and in particular of the industrial workers. Everyone understood what morale meant. It meant cities, it meant civilians, it meant fire. The man chosen to execute this directive was Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the same officer who had witnessed the Zeppelin raid 27 years earlier. Taking command of Bomber Command on February 22, 1942, Harris immediately began planning what he called the bombers' offensive that would prove his theories correct. Harris understood that high explosive bombs alone wouldn't break Germany. Explosive created localized destruction. Buildings collapsed, but surrounding structures remained largely intact. Fire services could respond. Damage could be contained, but fire, properly deployed, fed on itself. One fire spreads to adjacent buildings. Multiple fires overwhelm fire services. Firestorms create their own weather, generating winds that spread flames faster than any response could contain them. The formula was simple. High explosive bombs first to shatter buildings, break water mains and kill fire crews, then incendiaries by the thousands to ignite the exposed timber in the wrecked structures. The fires would merge, intensify and become unstoppable. The first test of concentrated incendiary attack came on the night of March 28, 1942. 234 RAF bombers attacked Lübeck, a medieval city with closely packed timber-framed buildings. 400 tons of bombs, 60% incendiaries, were dropped in 90 minutes. The result exceeded Harris's expectations. The old city centre burned completely. 1,500 buildings were destroyed. Production at the Dornier aircraft factory, the supposed military target, was barely affected. But the psychological impact was enormous. Goebbels wrote in his diary that Lübeck had suffered terrible damage, calling it a Terrorangriff, terror attack. Hitler was reportedly enraged, demanding immediate retaliation. The British press celebrated. German morale was cracking. Harris had found his weapon. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Bomber Command refined its techniques. Rostock, Cologne, Hamburg. Each raid taught lessons. The Pathfinder Force, elite crews that marked targets with coloured flares, improved accuracy. New incendiary designs using metallic sodium and thermite burned hotter and were impossible to extinguish with water. The Germans fought back. They developed sophisticated radar-directed night fighters, established extensive flak batteries, and trained fire brigades specifically for mass casualty scenarios. Bomber Command casualties mounted. On some raids, 5% of attacking aircraft were lost. Crews faced a statistical certainty of death or capture before completing their tour of operations. But the offensive continued. Harris was convinced that sustained bombing would break German resistance without the need for ground invasion. Churchill, desperate for any way to strike back at Germany, while Soviet armies bore the brunt of land warfare, supported the campaign despite growing unease about civilian casualties. The breaking point came at Hamburg. On the night of July 24, 1943, 781 aircraft attacked the city with 2,117 tons of bombs. The raid itself was devastating but not unprecedented. Then nature and physics combined to create something new. Hamburg had been suffering an unprecedented heat wave. Temperatures exceeded 30 degrees Celsius for days. The city was tinder dry. The humidity was critically low. The raid struck the densely packed working class. Districts of Hammerbrook and Rothenburg sought, where timber buildings sat close together connected by narrow streets. The incendiaries ignited thousands of fires simultaneously. At approximately 1:20 a.m., the fires merged. What happened next had never been observed before. The fire generated heat so intense that air at ground level expanded violently upward at speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour. This created a massive low-pressure zone at ground level that sucked in air from surrounding areas to feed the flames. The inflowing air, heated to ignition temperature as it approached the fire, became a ring of flame surrounding the central conflagration. The firestorm had been born. Inside the firestorm zone, conditions exceeded comprehension. Air temperatures reached 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass, hot enough that human bodies didn't burn so much as vaporize. The hurricane-force winds ripped people from shelters and hurled them into the flames. Those who sought safety in basements died as the firestorm consumed all oxygen, leaving behind rooms full of undamaged corpses that had suffocated in their shelters. Margaret Burkhardt, one of the few survivors from the firestorm zone, later testified about what she witnessed. The streets were on fire. The sky was fire. The air itself burned with each breath. People were stuck to the melting asphalt, unable to move, burning alive where they stood. The wind was so strong it tore children from their mother's arms and threw them into the flames. I saw a woman holding a baby. The wind pulled the child away and threw it like a doll into a burning building. The mother tried to follow, but the asphalt had melted under her feet. She stood there screaming as her legs burned, unable to move, until she fell and the flames consumed her. The firestorm burned for 3 hours. When it finally exhausted its fuel, 8 square miles of Hamburg had been reduced to ash. 40,000 people were dead. Most couldn't be identified. Many had been reduced to ash. Others were found fused together in masses of melted human remains. The shelters were full of corpses that appeared to be sleeping, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning as the fire consumed all available oxygen. Hamburg Police President Joachim Kerl reported to Berlin that conditions in the destroyed districts were beyond description. Buildings had been reduced to ash piles. Stone structures had collapsed entirely. The streets were impassable, blocked by debris and covered in a layer of ash several feet deep that was still radiating heat days after the attack. The psychological impact was catastrophic. 900,000 survivors fled Hamburg. Industrial production in the city dropped by 50% and didn't recover for months. Goebbels, reading the reports, wrote in his diary that Hamburg had suffered a catastrophe, the extent of which simply staggers the imagination. For the first time in the war, senior Nazi officials privately discussed the possibility of defeat. Hitler ordered that information about Hamburg be suppressed. The German public couldn't be allowed to know that a single air raid could destroy a major city. Neutral observers in Sweden reported seeing the glow of Hamburg burning from across the Baltic Sea, over 200 miles away. Harris saw Hamburg as proof of concept. A firestorm could do what conventional bombing couldn't, truly break a city's ability to function. But Hamburg had been an accident, a combination of weather conditions, building density and raid timing that couldn't be easily replicated. Throughout late 1943 and 1944, Bomber Command tried repeatedly to create another firestorm. Berlin, Stuttgart, Nuremberg. Each raid killed thousands, but none achieved Hamburg's apocalyptic destruction. The firestorm remained elusive. Meanwhile, the bomber offensive was bleeding. German night fighters equipped with radar were achieving kill rates exceeding 10% on some missions. The raid on Nuremberg on March 30, 1944 lost 106 aircraft out of 779 dispatched, a catastrophic 13.5% loss rate. At that rate, bomber crews couldn't survive their tour of operations. Then the invasion of France succeeded. Allied armies were advancing toward Germany. The strategic situation changed fundamentally. Germany could now be defeated by ground forces supported by tactical air power. The strategic bombing campaign that had consumed enormous resources and killed tens of thousands of air crew no longer seemed essential to victory. Harris faced an existential crisis. If strategic bombing wasn't necessary, then Bomber Command's casualties had been wasted. The entire doctrine he had championed would be discredited. He needed a demonstration that bombing alone could break German resistance. He needed another Hamburg. The target selection happened through a convergence of factors that historians still debate. Dresden, located in eastern Germany, had been largely untouched by bombing. Its population had swollen to perhaps 630,000, including refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. Intelligence reports suggested significant troop movements through the city. The Soviets had requested attacks on German transportation hubs to ease their advance. Dresden's city centre, an architectural masterpiece of Baroque buildings surrounding medieval timber structures, was a firestorm waiting to happen. The planning began in early February 1945. Bomber Command would strike in 2 waves separated by 3 hours, a tactic designed to catch fire services in the open during the second attack. The Americans would follow with a daylight raid to destroy anything that survived. The weather had to be perfect, clear and cold with low humidity. February 13th provided those conditions. At 10:03 p.m. on February 13th, 244 RAF Lancaster bombers began their attack run on Dresden. The Pathfinders, using H-2S radar navigation, marked the aiming point with green target indicators directly over the Altstadt, the old city centre. The markers fell with devastating accuracy, clustering within 300 yards of the designated aim point. The bombers that followed dropped their loads in a carefully orchestrated pattern. First came 4-pound and 30-pound explosive bombs to blow off roofs, shatter windows, and expose the timber frameworks of buildings. Then the incendiaries. Thousands upon thousands of 4-pound magnesium incendiary bombs designed to burn at 2,000 degrees and ignite anything combustible within a 20-foot radius. The raid lasted 25 minutes. 900 tons of bombs, 2/3 of them incendiaries, saturated an area of approximately 2 square miles. Then the bombers turned for home. The fires began immediately. The explosive bombs had done their work perfectly. Buildings stood with their roofs gone and their windows blown out, essentially chimneys filled with exposed timber furniture and structural wood. The incendiaries ignited everything. Within 30 minutes, thousands of individual fires were burning. Helmut Voigt, a Dresden firefighter, later testified about what he saw from the Altstadt fire station. The sky turned red within minutes. Not orange, not yellow, but deep red like looking into a blast furnace. Fires were erupting everywhere. We responded to the nearest, a burning apartment block on Pragerstrasse. Before we could connect our hoses, the building next to it ignited, then the one beside that. We realized we weren't fighting individual fires anymore. The entire district was burning. The order came to evacuate the Altstadt, get everyone into the Grosser Garten, the large park, open space away from buildings. We started moving civilians. That's when the second wave hit. At 1:30 a.m., 3 hours after the first raid ended, 529 more Lancaster bombers appeared over Dresden. The crews could see the fires from 100 miles away. The Pathfinders didn't need to mark targets. The entire city centre was already visible from space. The second wave dropped 1,800 tons of bombs, again 2/3 incendiaries, into an area already saturated with fire. The effect was instantaneous. The fires that had been spreading slowly suddenly erupted. At approximately 1:50 a.m. the fires merged. The Dresden firestorm, larger and more intense than Hamburg, ignited with a roar that survivors described as sounding like 1,000 locomotives. Victor Klemperer, a Jewish professor who had been forced to work in a factory, was in his apartment when the second raid struck. He survived only because he was in a stone building on the edge of the firestorm zone. His diary entry written days later captures the horror. The sky was no longer sky. It was a solid sheet of fire reaching from horizon to horizon. The wind came like a wall of force, smashing windows inward, tearing doors off hinges. The sound was beyond description. Not explosions anymore, but a continuous roar like standing next to a waterfall. People were screaming, but you couldn't hear individual voices, just a collective wail of terror. I watched from the window. The air itself was glowing red. People were running in the streets, their clothes and hair on fire. They would run a few steps and collapse. The wind would pick up their bodies and throw them through the air like leaves. A woman tried to shelter in a doorway across the street. The heat was so intense that she burst into flames before the fire reached her. Just spontaneous combustion from the radiant heat. Her body burned so fast there was nothing left but ash in seconds. The firestorm created a thermal column that rose 15,000 feet into the night sky, visible to bomber crews returning to England. Ground-level winds exceeded 100 miles per hour, strong enough to uproot trees and collapse buildings that hadn't been hit by bombs. The fire generated its own weather system. Witnesses reported burning debris being lifted thousands of feet into the air and carried miles away, starting spot fires across the entire city. The temperature in the central firestorm zone reached an estimated 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel. Bodies didn't burn, they liquefied. Thousands of people died in the Grosser Garten where they had fled for safety. The park offered no protection from radiant heat. Trees burst into flame simultaneously. People suffocated as the firestorm consumed all available oxygen or died from thermal shock as their lungs seared from breathing superheated air. Margaret Fryer's account of surviving in the Grossergarten remains the most detailed testimony of conditions inside the firestorm zone. I saw people simply fall down dead with no visible injuries. The heat was killing them where they stood. A group of soldiers tried to help civilians. They formed a chain, holding hands, moving toward the Elbe River. The wind was so strong they had to hold each other to avoid being blown away. I watched the chain break as people combusted one after another. Their uniforms ignited, they let go, and they were blown into the flames like torches. I tried to run, but the asphalt had melted. My shoes stuck. I had to pull my feet out and run in my stockings. The melted tar burned through my stockings in seconds. The pain was indescribable. I saw a mother with 3 children trying to reach the river. The wind caught them. The mother held the children, but one by one the wind tore them from her arms and threw them into the burning buildings. She screamed their names, but the wind was too loud to hear. Then she burst into flames and collapsed. Fryer survived by lying in a water reservoir that was boiling from the heat. She shared the reservoir with dozens of others. Throughout the night, people died beside her as the water temperature rose. Those who left the water to escape the heat burst into flames within seconds. By dawn, Fryer was one of 3 survivors in the reservoir. The bodies of the others floated around her, partially cooked by the boiling water. The firestorm burned for 14 hours. When dawn broke on February 14th, Dresden's city centre no longer existed. More than 600 acres had been reduced to ash. Buildings that had stood for 300 years were gone. The only structures remaining were stone walls standing isolated in fields of debris. The Frauenkirche, Dresden's iconic church, had survived the bombing, but its interior was burning. At 10 a.m. the heat caused the stone dome to collapse inward, sending up a column of ash visible across the city. At midday, 311 American B-17 bombers appeared over Dresden for the planned daylight raid. What they saw was beyond their briefing. The city wasn't there anymore, just smoke rising from ash fields. The bombardiers, trained to hit specific targets, couldn't identify anything. They dropped their bombs anyway, 771 tons of high explosive into the ruins, killing survivors who had emerged from shelters. The smoke from Dresden was visible from Prague, 90 miles away. Soviet troops advancing on Dresden reported seeing the smoke column from 40 miles away. Pilots flying supply missions from England to the Eastern Front reported seeing Dresden burning from 200 miles away at 25,000 feet. The death toll took months to estimate and remains controversial. The Nazi government, desperate to use the raid for propaganda, initially claimed 200,000 dead. Post-war research established the number at approximately 25,000, though exact figures are impossible because so many victims were completely destroyed. The Altstadt cemetery contains a mass grave where the remains of 6,165 victims were buried. Most couldn't be identified. Many were reduced to ash. The shelters were full of intact corpses that had suffocated when the firestorm consumed all oxygen. Recovery crews found entire families sitting at tables in basement shelters, appearing to be sleeping but dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. The work of clearing the city took months. In some areas, the ash layer was several feet deep. Buildings that appeared structurally sound collapsed when workers tried to enter them, the internal timber supports having been reduced to ash while stone walls remained standing. The smell of decomposing bodies trapped in rubble persisted through the summer. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Many simply walked away from the city, leaving everything behind. Those who remained moved through the ruins in a state of shock. Otto Griebel, a Dresden artist who survived, wrote that after the raid, people stopped speaking. They moved through the ash like ghosts, not communicating, barely acknowledging each other. The city had died and taken the survivors' souls with it. News of Dresden's destruction reached Britain within days. The reaction was conflicted. Official reports celebrated another successful raid. The Air Ministry press release stated that Dresden, a major industrial centre and transportation hub, had been successfully attacked in support of Soviet operations. Churchill had personally approved the raid, but now, seeing the results, began distancing himself. In a memo that would later be heavily revised, he questioned whether the bombing of German cities had gone too far, writing that the destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. Harris was furious at the suggestion that he had exceeded his authority. He had been ordered to destroy German cities. He had developed the means to do so efficiently. Now politicians who had given those orders were attempting to claim moral high ground by questioning his methods. The controversy intensified when a German propaganda broadcast picked up by Allied intelligence provided detailed casualty figures and explicit descriptions of civilian deaths. The Nazis, who had pioneered terror bombing, were now using Allied raids as proof of Anglo-American barbarity. Neutral countries, particularly Sweden and Switzerland, published critical articles questioning whether the Allies were adopting Nazi methods. The moral debate would continue for decades. Defenders of the raid argued that Dresden was a legitimate military target, a transportation hub moving German troops to fight Soviet forces. That civilian deaths, however tragic, were an unavoidable consequence of total war. That Germany had started the bombing of civilians and therefore couldn't complain about retaliation. Critics countered that by February 1945, Germany was clearly defeated, that Dresden's military significance was minimal, that the deliberate creation of a firestorm demonstrated intent to kill civilians rather than destroy military targets, that the scale of destruction served no military purpose and was simply revenge. Harris never wavered in his defense of the raid. In his post-war memoirs, he argued that Dresden's destruction shortened the war and saved Allied lives, that every German city destroyed meant fewer German soldiers fighting on the front, that the bomber offensive, including Dresden, broke German industrial capacity and morale. The statistics support some of Harris's arguments. German war production peaked in September 1944 and declined steadily thereafter, partly due to bombing damage. The transportation system was crippled, hampering movement of troops and supplies. Civilian morale, while never collapsing completely, was severely damaged. Workers in bombed cities showed reduced productivity and increased absenteeism. But the statistics also show the limitations of strategic bombing. German industrial production remained substantial through April 1945, just weeks before surrender. The bombing killed approximately 400,000 German civilians but didn't break popular resistance. Germany surrendered only when Allied ground forces physically occupied the country. The bomber offensive consumed enormous resources. Bomber Command lost 55 youthmen and 573 aircrew killed, a casualty rate exceeding 44%. The United States 8th Air Force lost 26,000 dead. The industrial capacity devoted to building bombers, training crews, and producing bombs represented resources that could have been used for tactical air support or ground forces. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, testified at Nuremberg that the bomber offensive had significantly damaged German production, but hadn't prevented the manufacture of weapons. He argued that dispersing factories and moving production underground had largely negated the bombing's impact by late 1944. The human cost extended beyond those killed in the raids. German children raised during the bombing campaign suffered psychological trauma that manifested decades later. Studies of survivors showed elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and PTSD symptoms. The bombing destroyed Germany's architectural heritage. Irreplaceable medieval city centres were erased. Cultural treasures accumulated over centuries were lost in hours. The strategic bombing campaign, including Dresden, represented a fundamental shift in warfare. Previous conflicts had drawn distinctions between soldiers and civilians, military and civilian targets. Strategic bombing erased those distinctions. Entire cities became battlefields. Civilians became targets. The logic was industrial. Modern warfare required industrial capacity. Industrial capacity depended on workers. Workers lived in cities. Therefore, destroying cities destroyed war-making capacity. This logic led inexorably to total war where nothing and no one was immune from attack. The culmination came not at Dresden, but in Japan. On March 9, 1945, American B-29s firebombed Tokyo using the lessons learned in Europe. Wallace 665 tons of incendiaries created a firestorm that killed approximately 100,000 people in one night. Over the following months, American bombers systematically burned Japanese cities. By August 1945, 67 cities had been destroyed by firebombing. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while more dramatic were simply extensions of the same strategy, a single bomber replacing 500 bombers to achieve the same result. The immediate destruction of an entire city. The psychological shock to force surrender. In 1953, Bomber Command received official recognition. A campaign medal was finally struck. But Harris was not elevated to the peerage, an honour granted to other senior commanders. The bombing campaign remained controversial. Harris died in 1984, still defending his actions, still insisting that the bomber offensive had been essential to victory. In 1992, a statue of Harris was erected outside the RAF Church of St Clement Danes in London. The unveiling ceremony was disrupted by protesters who called Harris a war criminal. Eggs and paint were thrown. Veterans who had served under Harris stood guard over the statue in tears, insisting they had done their duty. The debate continues. Dresden has been rebuilt, its historic centre reconstructed with painstaking accuracy. The Frauenkirche, left as a ruin throughout the Cold War, was rebuilt between 1994 and 2005, using original plans and surviving stone fragments. The rebuilt church stands as both memorial and symbol of reconciliation. On the domes, cross stands a new golden orb forged by a British blacksmith whose father had flown in the raid. The son of a bomber pilot helped rebuild what his father had destroyed. Every February 13th, Dresden holds memorial ceremonies. Neo-Nazis attempt to use the anniversary for propaganda, claiming inflated death tolls and falsely comparing the bombing to the Holocaust. Historians and survivors push back, insisting on accurate numbers and proper context. The firebombing of Dresden was catastrophic, but it was not genocide. It was war. Total war, with all the horror that implies. The lessons of Dresden extend beyond debates about strategic bombing. The raid demonstrated that technology had outpaced morality, that weapons existed capable of destroying entire cities in hours, that in total war, distinguishing between soldiers and civilians became impossible. That victory achieved through such means would be forever tainted by questions about whether the cost was worth paying. In 1963, Kurt Vonnegut published Slaughterhouse 5, a novel based on his experience as a prisoner of war in Dresden during the firebombing. His description of the aftermath captures something statistics cannot. The city looked like the moon now, nothing but mineralized dust. The human beings had turned to steam and ash. Vonnegut's protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, becomes unstuck in time, reliving the bombing repeatedly, unable to escape the trauma. The novel suggests that some experiences are beyond rational comprehension, that horror on such scale breaks normal narrative. All you can say is so it goes. Modern warfare has not abandoned the principles demonstrated at Dresden. Precision-guided weapons have replaced area bombing, but the goal remains destroying an enemy's capacity and will to fight. Cities remain targets, civilians remain casualties. The technology has changed, but the fundamental logic hasn't. Dresden burned for 14 hours. 79 years later, the sky above the city is clear and blue. Buildings reconstructed to match their Baroque originals stand where ash fields once stretched. Tourists photograph churches and palaces, often unaware of what happened here. But in the city archives, in the mass graves, in the memories of the last survivors, the fire still burns. The firebombing of Dresden was not an aberration or a war crime uniquely different from other Allied bombing raids. It was the perfection of a strategy pursued deliberately for 3 years. Hamburg had shown what was possible. Dresden proved it could be repeated. The sky turned red because men with slide rules and maps calculated exactly how many incendiary bombs were needed to ignite a city, then manufactured those bombs, trained the crews, and delivered them with precision. The Reich broke not from one raid, but from years of systematic destruction. Dresden was simply the most visible demonstration of what total war meant in the age of strategic bombing. The most horrifying aspect of Dresden wasn't that it happened. It was how efficiently it was done, how thoroughly the techniques had been refined through trial and error, how completely air power had transformed warfare. The bombers came at 10 p.m. By noon the next day, the city centre no longer existed. 14 hours from vibrant city to ash field. In those 14 hours, every assumption about limits in warfare died. The sky turned red over Dresden because men had decided that burning a city would shorten a war. They were probably wrong. Germany surrendered 3 months later due to ground force advances, not bombing. But in February 1945, standing in the ruins, watching smoke rise from what had been Baroque masterpieces and medieval treasures, survivors couldn't think about strategic questions. They could only remember what they had seen. Bodies that burst into flames without fire touching them, children torn from mothers' arms by hurricane winds and thrown into the flames, shelters full of intact corpses that had suffocated while the city burned, streets of melted asphalt where people had been trapped and burned alive, the smell of burning human flesh that persisted for months. The bombing war ended in August 1945 with mushroom clouds over Japan, but Dresden remained its most controversial chapter, not because it was worse than other raids, but because it happened so late, against a defeated enemy, with such total devastation that even those who ordered it began to question whether they had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. The sky turned red over Dresden because war had become total, because technology made the previously impossible routine, because desperate men chose desperate measures. Whether that choice was justified remains debated. What isn't debatable is the result. In 14 hours, fire consumed a city. The Reich didn't break from Dresden alone, but Dresden demonstrated that nothing was safe, nowhere was protected, that total war meant exactly that. Total. The last word belongs to the survivors. Margaret Fryer lived until 2013. She gave interviews about February 13th, 1945 until the end of her life. Her final interview included this statement: "People ask if I hate the men who bombed Dresden. I don't. They were following orders, doing what they thought was necessary to end the war, but I want people to know what fire does to a city, what it does to human beings, so that they understand the cost of the decisions made in those war rooms, so they think very carefully before deciding that burning a city is an acceptable military tactic. I survived the Dresden firestorm. My city didn't. Neither did my family. Neither did 25,000 others. The fire took everything. All that's left are memories and questions about whether it had to happen that way. The sky turned red. Dresden burned. The Reich was broken. But the price of victory, measured in ash and bone, and the screams of those who burned, remains beyond calculation. The technical achievement of creating a firestorm on demand represented a dark milestone in military science. After Dresden, Allied planners understood the formula precisely. Building density mattered more than size. Medieval city centres with timber frame construction were ideal. Weather conditions had to be monitored carefully. Low humidity, dry conditions, and stable atmospheric pressure created optimal burning conditions. Wind speed at ground level needed to be moderate, enough to spread flames but not so strong as to disperse the heat. The incendiary loads were calculated with mathematical precision. British analysts determined that approximately 650 incendiary bombs per acre were needed to guarantee fire saturation in densely built areas. The mixture of high explosive and incendiary had to follow a specific ratio. Too much high explosive simply created rubble that was difficult to ignite. Too many incendiaries without structural damage allowed fire services to respond effectively. The timing between waves was critical. 3 hours gave fires time to develop and merge, but caught emergency services in the open during their response. Hamburg had taught this lesson accidentally. Dresden proved it could be replicated deliberately. The operational research section of Bomber Command had turned mass murder into an engineering problem, complete with charts, graphs, and efficiency calculations. The Americans initially resisted British area bombing tactics. The United States Army Air Force's doctrine emphasized precision daylight bombing of specific industrial targets. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, argued that American bomb sites could hit factories, oil refineries and rail yards without destroying surrounding cities. He believed terror bombing was both immoral and ineffective. Reality eroded American scruples. High-altitude precision bombing proved far less precise than doctrine claimed. The Norden bomb site, America's top-secret weapon, could theoretically place a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. In practice, hitting the right city was considered good performance. Weather over Europe, with its constant cloud cover, made visual bombing impossible most days. Radar bombing, the alternative, had accuracy measured in miles. More significantly, casualties mounted. German fighters and flak-destroyed bombers at unsustainable rates. The Schweinfurt raids in August and October 1943 demonstrated the problem. Attacking ball-bearing factories deep in Germany, the 8th Air Force lost 120 bombers in 2 missions. At that rate, complete crew turnover occurred every 3 months. Something had to change. The solution was fighter escorts. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back, but this created a new problem. With escorts neutralizing German fighters, bomber casualties dropped but accuracy didn't improve, bombs still scattered across cities. The distinction between precision and area bombing became academic when your precision attacks destroyed entire neighborhoods. By late 1944, American doctrine had quietly shifted. Official statements still emphasized military targets, but operational orders increasingly accepted civilian casualties as unavoidable. The firebombing of Japanese cities made the transformation complete. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, explicitly abandoned precision bombing in favor of area incendiary attacks designed to burn Japanese cities. The Tokyo raid on March 9, 1945, demonstrated how thoroughly Americans had adopted British methods. LeMay stripped defensive guns from his B-29s to carry more incendiaries. He ordered low-altitude attacks, 5,000 feet instead of 20,000, to improve accuracy and bomb concentration. He chose a densely packed working-class district as the aiming point, guaranteeing maximum civilian casualties. The raid dropped 1,065 tons of incendiaries in 3 hours. The firestorm that resulted killed approximately 100,000 people in one night, more than Dresden, more than Hamburg, more than any single raid in the European theatre. 15 square miles of Tokyo burned completely. The heat was so intense that water in canals boiled. Bodies were piled in heaps at bridges where crowds had stampeded trying to escape. LeMay's justification was purely utilitarian. Japanese war production depended on small workshops distributed throughout residential areas. Destroying the districts destroyed production capacity. Whether this was true or simply rationalization for terror bombing remains debated. What's undebatable is that LeMay continued the campaign systematically. Between March and August 1945, American bombers burned 67 Japanese cities. The casualty figures were staggering. Estimates suggest between 300,000 and 900,000 Japanese civilians died in the firebombing campaign. The exact number is unknown because record-keeping collapsed as cities burned. Entire neighborhoods were erased with no survivors to report casualties. The firebombing killed more Japanese civilians than both atomic bombs combined. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th were simply the culmination of strategic bombing logic. Instead of 500 bombers burning a city over 3 hours, one bomber could destroy a city in seconds. The weapon was different, but the strategy was identical. Urban destruction to force surrender through psychological shock and industrial devastation. The moral distinction between conventional and atomic weapons is largely artificial. The victims of conventional firebombing suffered deaths as horrible as atomic bomb victims. Thermal radiation burned people at both Hiroshima and Dresden. Asphyxiation killed thousands in both Tokyo and Hamburg. The mushroom cloud was more dramatic than the smoke column over burning cities, but the result was the same. Entire urban populations destroyed in hours. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, vindicated strategic bombing in the eyes of its practitioners. Harris argued that bombing had broken German resistance. LeMay insisted that firebombing alone would have forced Japanese surrender without invasion. The atomic bombs simply accelerated the inevitable. Air power had proven decisive. The counter-argument is equally compelling. Germany fought until Soviet and American armies occupied Berlin. No amount of bombing caused surrender before ground forces made resistance impossible. Japan surrendered after Soviet entry into the war made their position hopeless, not simply from bombing. The atomic bombs provided a face-saving excuse to surrender, but ground invasion would have succeeded regardless. Statistical analysis suggests the bomber offensive achieved some objectives but at enormous cost. German war production was damaged but never stopped. Transportation systems were disrupted but continued functioning. Civilian morale suffered but never collapsed. The 400,000 German civilians killed by bombing didn't translate directly into military advantage. Each bomber lost represented crews trained for years. Each raid consumed resources that might have been used elsewhere. The raids also generated hatred that persisted for generations. German survivors of bombing developed deep antagonism toward the Allies that complicated post-war reconstruction. The Soviet Union used Allied bombing and propaganda, claiming Western powers were barbarians. The moral high ground claimed by the Allies was undercut by images of burned cities and civilian casualties. The long-term effects of strategic bombing extended beyond physical destruction. Entire generations grew up traumatized by the experience. German children who survived the bombing campaigns showed psychological damage that manifested throughout their lives. Studies decades later found elevated rates of anxiety disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress among survivors. The trauma was transmitted to subsequent generations. Children of survivors showed higher rates of psychological problems despite not experiencing the bombing themselves. The architectural and cultural losses were irreplaceable. Medieval city centres that had survived for centuries were erased in hours. Dresden's Altstadt, Hamburg's Old Town, the centres of Cologne, Lübeck, Würzburg, dozens of other cities. Centuries of accumulated cultural heritage turned to ash. Some was rebuilt, but reconstruction, however faithful, isn't the same as the original structures that bore the marks of centuries of use. The strategic bombing campaign also established precedents that shaped Cold War doctrine. Both the United States and Soviet Union developed nuclear strategies based on destroying enemy cities. Mutual assured destruction, the doctrine that prevented World War III, was simply strategic bombing raised to absolute level. The willingness to burn Dresden made threatening to incinerate Moscow credible. In 1961, a group of former Bomber Command aircrew organised a reunion in London. Several hundred veterans attended, men now in their 40s and 50s who had flown missions over Germany 2 decades earlier. The organisers arranged for a German veterans group to attend, former Luftwaffe pilots and aircrew. The meeting was tense initially. These men had tried to kill each other. They had succeeded in killing many of their comrades. But as the evening progressed, something unexpected happened. The British veterans shared stories of terror during bombing runs, watching aircraft beside them explode, the fear during the long flight home damaged and low on fuel. The German veterans described similar experiences from the defending side, the odds they faced, the friends they lost. Both sides discovered they had more in common with each other than with civilians who hadn't experienced aerial combat. One exchange, recorded by a journalist attending, captured the complexity of moral judgment. A British navigator who had flown 32 missions, including Dresden, met a German night fighter pilot who had shot down 7 bombers. The German asked directly whether the British navigator felt guilt about the civilians killed in his raids. The navigator's response was honest. He said that during the war he hadn't thought about it. They were briefed on targets, told what to hit, and focused on surviving the mission. The people below were abstractions, not real. Only after the war, seeing photographs of the destruction, reading survivor accounts, did the reality of what they had done sink in. Yes, he felt guilt. But he also felt that given the same circumstances, the same information, the same pressures, he would make the same choices again. War removed moral clarity. You did what you were ordered to do and hoped it was right. The German pilot nodded. He understood. His job had been shooting down bombers to protect German cities. He had done it efficiently. He didn't hate the British aircrew. They were doing their jobs just as he was doing his. The real question wasn't whether individuals were guilty. The question was whether the strategy itself was justified. That question remained unanswered at the reunion. It remains unanswered today. The strategic bombing campaign killed approximately 600,000 civilians in Germany and Japan combined. It destroyed hundreds of cities. It created trauma that echoed through generations. Whether this shortened the war, saved Allied lives, or was necessary for victory depends on counterfactual arguments that can never be proven. What can be proven is that technology had advanced faster than military ethics. The ability to destroy cities from the air existed before any framework for determining when such destruction was acceptable. The laws of war, developed for ground combat between armies, didn't adequately address strategic bombing. The distinction between military and civilian targets blurred when industrial capacity became the target rather than armies. The Geneva Conventions, revised after World War II, attempted to address this. Additional protocols added in 1977 explicitly prohibited attacks on civilian populations and required proportionality in attacks that might cause civilian casualties. But these rules were written after the fact. During World War II, no clear legal framework existed. Both sides bombed cities and justified it as military necessity. The cultural memory of the bombing war varies dramatically by nation. In Britain, Bomber Command veterans were long treated with ambivalence. They had done terrible things in the nation's name, but admitting this created uncomfortable questions about British conduct in the war. The bomber offensive was quietly de-emphasised in official histories. Harris was denied honours. The aircrew received no campaign medal until 2013. In Germany, the bombing became a source of victimhood that complicated reckoning with Nazi crimes. Right-wing groups emphasized German suffering while minimizing or denying the Holocaust. Honest discussion of the bombing was difficult because acknowledging Allied atrocities seemed to diminish German responsibility for the war. Mainstream German historians emphasize that Germany started the bombing of civilians and therefore bore ultimate responsibility for what followed. In America, the firebombing campaign against Japan received less attention than the atomic bombs. The conventional bombing that killed hundreds of thousands was overshadowed by nuclear weapons that killed fewer but were more dramatic. LeMay, who had planned the Tokyo raid, became a celebrated military figure, eventually commanding Strategic Air Command. His role in mass civilian casualties was rarely mentioned in official biographies. In Japan, the bombing became incorporated into a narrative of victimization that often ignored Japanese aggression that started the Pacific War. Hiroshima and Nagasaki received enormous attention, understandably given their historical significance. But the conventional firebombing that killed more people received less focus, perhaps because conventional bombs lacked the moral clarity of nuclear weapons. By the 1960s, strategic bombing had evolved into nuclear deterrence. The massive bomber fleets were replaced by smaller numbers of jets carrying hydrogen bombs. A single B-52 could deliver more destructive power than the entire bomber command raid on Dresden. The firestorm that took 1,000 bombers to create in Hamburg could now be generated by one aircraft in one pass. But the experience of conventional strategic bombing informed nuclear strategy. Planners understood exactly what urban destruction meant. They had data on firestorms, civilian casualties, infrastructure damage. The single integrated operational plan, America's nuclear war plan, included detailed predictions of casualties and destruction based on World War II bombing data. They knew what burning cities looked like because they had already burned dozens of them. The ultimate irony of strategic bombing is that it succeeded in preventing its own repetition. The horror of burned cities, captured in photographs and survivor testimonies, made nuclear war unthinkable. Mutual assured destruction worked precisely because both sides understood what city destruction meant. The firestorms of Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo created a visceral understanding that made actually using nuclear weapons impossible for rational actors. In 1990, the Cold War ended without the nuclear exchange that strategic bombing doctrine had prepared for. The bombers built to destroy cities were retired or converted to conventional weapons. The doctrine of city destruction was officially abandoned. Modern military ethics emphasize precision and minimizing civilian casualties. Laser-guided weapons can hit individual buildings. Regulations require avoiding civilian areas when possible. Yet the fundamental questions raised by strategic bombing remain unresolved. When is civilian suffering justified by military necessity? How many innocent deaths are acceptable to shorten a war? Who makes these calculations and by what authority? Technology has changed, but the moral problems persist. Dresden's rebuilt Frauenkirche contains a chapel dedicated to reconciliation. British and German money funded the reconstruction. Prince Charles attended the rededication ceremony. The church's foundation includes stones blackened by the firestorm, preserved as reminder of what happened. The altar cross incorporates nails from Coventry Cathedral, destroyed by German bombing in 1940. Perpetrator and victim, cause and effect, joined in a structure meant to transcend national hatred. On the anniversary of the Dresden raid, church bells toll 25,000 times, once for each estimated victim. The ringing takes hours. Germans gather to remember what was lost. British survivors sometimes attend, paying respects to those killed by their actions. The ceremonies emphasize reconciliation rather than blame, acknowledging tragedy without assigning guilt. But outside the reconciliation ceremonies, darker commemorations occur. Neo-Nazi groups march through Dresden claiming hundreds of thousands died, inflating numbers to create false equivalence with the Holocaust. They chant about Allied war crimes while displaying symbols of the regime that started the bombing of civilians. Police separate them from counter-protesters. The bombing's memory is weaponized for contemporary politics. Historical truth becomes a battleground. Scholars painstakingly document actual casualties to counter inflated claims. Archives are examined, burial records analyzed, survivor testimonies recorded before the last witnesses die. The Dresden Historians Commission spent years establishing that approximately 25,000 died, not 200,000 or 500,000 as propaganda claimed. But false numbers persist because they serve ideological purposes. The last survivors are dying. Margaret Fryer died in 2013 at age 90. Her testimony, preserved in interviews and written accounts, remains one of the most detailed descriptions of surviving a firestorm. Victor Klemperer died in 1960. His diaries, published posthumously, provide a Jewish survivor's perspective on both Nazi persecution and Allied bombing. Lothar Metzger, who survived as a child in a basement shelter, gave his last interview in 2020 at age 80. Soon, no living witnesses will remain. Without survivors, memory becomes history. Personal experience gives way to interpretation. The bombing of Dresden transforms from lived trauma to historical event, analysed and debated but not felt. Future generations will know the facts, the numbers, the strategic rationale. They won't know the sound of a firestorm, the smell of burning flesh, the terror of a sky that had turned to fire. Perhaps that distance is necessary. Perhaps rational evaluation requires emotional separation. Or perhaps something essential is lost when trauma becomes abstract, when horror becomes data points on charts. The strategic bombing campaign can be analysed as military strategy, industrial warfare, technological evolution. But at its core, it was hundreds of thousands of individual deaths, each a person who experienced terror and pain before dying. The aircrew who delivered these attacks were also casualties of a sort. They followed orders, believing they were shortening the war and saving lives. Most were barely old enough to vote. They climbed into aircraft knowing their odds of survival were poor. They watched friends die. They dealt with fear on every mission. Then they came home to discover that what they thought was heroism was now considered morally problematic. Many Bomber Command veterans never spoke about their experiences. The missions were classified for decades. Discussing them invited questions they couldn't answer. Was Dresden necessary? Were the civilian deaths justified? They didn't know. They had trusted their commanders, their government, their cause. Discovering that trust might have been misplaced was devastating. Easier to remain silent. Some veterans became advocates for peace. They spoke at schools, describing what strategic bombing meant in human terms. They emphasized that war from the air isn't clean or surgical, that burning cities kills children and elderly and innocent civilians who had no control over their government's policies, that the psychological scars last longer than physical damage, that victory achieved through such means is hollow. Others remained convinced their actions were justified. They pointed to Nazi atrocities, to concentration camps, to aggressive war that killed millions. They argued that Germans who voted for Hitler, worked in his factories, supported his regime, bore collective responsibility. That bombing German cities saved Allied lives by shortening the war. That squeamishness about civilian casualties would have meant Nazi victory. That hard men making hard decisions won the war. Both positions have merit. Both are incomplete. The truth is that strategic bombing existed in a moral grey area where traditional ethics didn't apply cleanly. It was neither clearly justified nor clearly criminal. It was warfare in the industrial age, where distinction between combatant and civilian collapsed because total war required total mobilization. The firebombing that broke the Reich demonstrated humanity's capacity for organized destruction. It showed that given sufficient motivation, democratic societies could adopt tactics as ruthless as any dictatorship. It proved that technology without ethical constraints leads to escalating horror. It established that in total war, nothing is sacred and no one is safe. It also demonstrated courage, sacrifice, and determination. The aircrew who flew through flak and fighters to deliver their bombs were brave. The planners who calculated raid effectiveness were skilled. The ground crews who maintained aircraft under terrible conditions were dedicated. That their efforts produced mass civilian casualties doesn't negate their individual courage. Condemning the strategy isn't the same as condemning the men who executed it. 79 years after Dresden burned, the questions raised by strategic bombing remain relevant. Modern militaries use precision weapons, but wars still kill civilians. Terrorist attacks deliberately target non-combatants using strategic bombing's logic. That psychological impact matters more than military effect. That breaking enemy will require attacking their society, not just their armies. The firestorm tactics have been abandoned, but the underlying assumptions persist. The sky turned red over Dresden because military planners concluded that burning a city would contribute to victory. They were probably wrong about Dresden's military significance. They were definitely right that they could create a firestorm on demand. The technical achievement was remarkable. The moral cost was catastrophic. Whether the trade-off was worth it depends on questions that have no objective answers. What remains beyond debate is the human cost. 25,000 people died in Dresden in 14 hours. 40,000 died in Hamburg. 100,000 in Tokyo. Hundreds of thousands across Germany and Japan. Each was a person with a life, a family, hopes, and fears. They died terribly, burning or suffocating or crushed. Their deaths were calculated in planning rooms and delivered efficiently by trained professionals. That efficiency, that calculated industrial approach to mass death, is perhaps more disturbing than the death themselves. War has always killed civilians. What made strategic bombing different was the deliberation. Cities weren't collateral damage, they were the target. Civilians weren't accidentally killed, they were intentionally attacked. The planners knew exactly what they were doing, calculated it precisely and executed it efficiently. The firestorms weren't accidents, they were achievements. That achievement haunts us because it reveals what humans are capable of when convinced that ends justify means. The men who planned. Dresden weren't monsters. They were rational military professionals doing their jobs. The aircrew who dropped the bombs weren't sadists. They were young men following orders. The politicians who approved the raids weren't evil. They were leaders trying to win a war against genuine evil. Yet together they created hell on earth. They turned cities into crematoriums. They killed tens of thousands in single nights. They developed industrial processes for mass death that would have impressed any bureaucrat. That they did this while believing they were righteous makes it more disturbing, not less. The firebombing that broke the Reich succeeded militarily but failed morally. It demonstrated that democracies at war will abandon peacetime ethics. That total war makes atrocities inevitable. That technology creates capabilities that exceed wisdom. That victory itself can be a form of defeat when the cost is measured in compromised principles and traumatized souls. The sky turned red over Dresden because men made it so. They chose the target, calculated the bomb load, briefed the crews, and launched the raid. Every step was deliberate. Every decision was rational according to the logic of total war. That logic led to firestorms that killed tens of thousands. Whether that logic was sound remains the question that haunts strategic bombing's legacy. The Reich broke. But something else broke too. The illusion that civilized nations wage civilized wars, that moral limits constrain military necessity, that technology serves humanity rather than commanding it. Dresden burned those illusions as thoroughly as it burned the city. What remains is memory, fading as survivors die, and questions, persistent as the smoke that rose from burning cities. Questions about when civilian deaths become acceptable, about whether military necessity justifies any action, about what victory means when achieved through methods that shame those who employ them. The sky turned red over Dresden. The Reich broke. But the moral reckoning continues, unresolved, perhaps unresolvable. The only certainty is that those who forget what happened in those burning cities risk repeating it. The only hope is that remembering creates wisdom that prevents repetition. The sky turned red. Let it never turn red again.